Local productions seen on Delta College Public Media are made possible with support from viewers like you. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Junia Doan's Spark. I'm Junia Doan, and thank you for joining us. My guest today is Pulitzer Prize winning author, journalist, and scholar Alex S. Jones. Welcome, Alex. How do you define journalism today? What did it mean originally, and how do you embrace it around the many ways to communicate with people these days?
Well, I look at it in the traditional way that I have always looked at it, and that has not changed. I think it is fact based. It is it is calculated at its best to be fair and balanced, and it's what it states to be as close to the understood truth of a situation as is possible to get. It requires intellectual honesty. And I feel like that is the kind of journalism that I really believe in. And it's built around a core of certified and verifiable facts. Um, and that's key. And that's something that has largely disappeared in much of the way the media works these days.
Some people don't believe there is a truth, but
Truth is an abstraction. But I mean, there is something called intellectual honesty, which means that if you have information that is certifiably factually true, then that is what I consider to be the core of journalism.
so, would you consider journalism anything but writing? And
Oh, yeah, of course.
how wide would you make that inclusion?
I would make it wide enough to be fact based. I would not include making it up, frankly. I mean, I do not consider journalism to be a lot of the, you know, stuff that you see on television that is clearly based not on certified, verifiable facts, but on the political, attitudes of the people involved. That's not journalism to me. That's being like a columnist. It's not that it's not got some value or worth, and people can accept it as journalism, but I don't.
I've gotten so when I read text like that, I usually start three paragraphs down because they've taken to writing with the individual, start with so and so, and this and that, and da 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 da, and then they get to the content they want to really talk about through this first example. And I miss the old New York Times. I grew up when they were long, long pieces written, but I don't know where to go for. Well, maybe some of the magazines, I guess, but
Well, I mean,
uh,
I worked for the New York Times for some years, and I can tell you that, the story that I won a Pulitzer Prize there for was a story that was a told story, but it was also based on fact that I had reported and was able to, demonstrate was truth. I mean, quotes had people's names attached, that kind of thing. Now, that's not the same thing as reporting the school board.
yes, I acknowledge the difference. From just a generalist point of view, um, what interests me is who decides, not who decides, but what topics are covered. So I often try to read the foreign press just to widen what they think is important, mostly local, but some on the rest. But how did you decide to become a journalist?
Well, I'm from a family of journalists. I'm in the fourth generation of journalists in my family. And so it came pretty. came pretty naturally to me. But, it was also something that I ultimately had to decide to do myself. And I left my family's small newspaper business in Tennessee and went to the New York Times. And that was, there's a big difference in small town journalism and New York Times journalism, but the core of, of reporting that is based on facts that you can justify being true and defend, that does not matter whether it doesn't matter whether you're the New York Times or the Daily Post Athenian in Athens, Tennessee, where I also worked. That's that's journalism.
So, when you were asked to write on the family to teach younger generations of the Times family what it was like and what the values were, did they say anything about leaving anything out or putting anything in? And I know the answer, but I just want to say
Well,
parenthetically, if
when I worked at the New York Times, I was there for almost 10 years. No one ever asked me to put something in or take something out in the sense that you're talking about. To cook the books, to make the story go a certain way. No, that never happened. And I think that the very best of what the New York Times represents is not doing things like that. I know that Max Frankel, for instance, now he was the executive editor part of the time when I was there, and he was a wonderful journalist, a refugee from Nazi Germany, and someone who had a kind of fundamental core of journalistic values that people at the New York Times shared. And that was that, if you're a reporter at the New York Times, you also write the story. You don't, it's not like Time Magazine style, where you have writers and then you have reporters who do different things. At the Times, the reporter writes too, but then the piece is edited. And that is something that usually improves it and is part of the process. So you report a story, you write a story, you turn it in, it goes to what they call the backfield, which is the first level of editing. Then it goes to the copy editors. And then if it's going to be a front page story, it goes to yet another round of editing called the news desk. That's the process. But the process is calculated to require the reporter to justify information that that is that is in the story. For instance, in the New York Times, you cannot give new information in a story in a quote. You can state something as a fact and attribute it, and then you can have a quote that basically reinforces that. But the information itself is part of the reporter's work. And the quote is something that bolsters that.
so. What is the definition when of evaluating an anonymous source?
Well, when I was at the New York Times, uh, there was a very strong rule that you could not have a pejorative quote or comment that was anonymous. It had to be it had to have somebody's name on it, or it couldn't go in. And I got reprimanded by Abe Rosenthal, who was the executive editor at that time, because of a I thought very mild comment quote about Newsweek magazine, and it was anonymous, but it was innocuous. I thought, well, Abe was a stickler for this, and he called me in and talked to me about it. He told me, that this, as far as he was concerned, I had stepped over that line. Now, I don't think he got, complaints from Newsweek, but the point was he cared about these things
When you were working with your wife on the two books, how did you work as a team?
with great difficulty. After we wrote our first book together about the Bingham family, we said to each other that we would never do it again. But we were tempted by the fact that nobody had ever written an independent book about the Ox and Sulzberger family. There had been books, but they were either, family books or, house book, what they call house books, books that were controlled. And no publisher would defy the New York Times by having an independent book, because the New York Times was the most powerful voice in book publishing. Well, that changed with Kitty Kelly. When her book about Ronald Reagan came out, there was a lot of uh, understanding that the world of book publishing had changed, and that subjects that uh, were important could be written about by independent people. So we went to the Ox and Sulzberger family, to Punch Sulzberger, really, who was the head of the family, and proposed doing a book about the family. And he, I had worked at the Times, I'd won a Pulitzer at the Times, he'd read our book about the Binghams, and ultimately he decided to give his permission, personally, his permission. Now, he didn't speak for the rest of the family, and he told me that. He said, I can't speak for the rest of them, but I knew that if he gave his permission, then the rest of them would very likely go along with it. And sure enough, Arthur Sulzberger Jr., his son, I was working at the New York Times and we had this conversation, called me into his office after his father had announced that he was going to, be party to this independent. An independent book meant that they wouldn't see a word of it until it was in galley proofs. Uh, he called me in and said, if it'd been up to me, I wouldn't have done it.
Interesting. Interesting. Um, the different personalities, maybe.
I think Punch believed, and Punch was a wise, shrewd man. First of all, he believed that Susan and I would do the work. I mean, we were not setting out to write a salacious book, but we were going to write a book that would represent work. And it did. It took us 7 years to do it. But he also knew that probably somebody was going to do a book whether he liked it or not. And so we were, in a way, I think, for him and the family, the least of evils. There was going to be a book. We would do a serious book, and we would do the work to do that kind of book. But we were not going to do a Kitty Kelly book.
You must have had a lot of materials available to you. Were there diaries as well?
Well, we spent a year going through the New York Times archives. And that was the papers of Arthur Hayes Sulzberger, Punch's father, Adolph Ox, and many others. We also did several hundred interviews with members of the family and people who worked at the New York Times and who had some knowledge of the story we wanted to tell. So, yeah, there was a vast, I mean, I think people misunderstand the process of writing a book like this. Now, this was a doorstopper. I don't know whether you have a copy of it there, but it's a big book.
Yes, I've read a bunch of it. I really did
Yeah.
it in the
Uh,
different
uh,
sections.
The thing is that when you write a book like this, you don't just sit down and start writing. You have to do an enormous amount of interviewing and research. And then you have a next step, which is to get your arms around all that information and to put it in a form which allows you to use it when you're in the process of actually doing the writing, which is the last step. It took us, 5 years to report and organize, and then we spent 2 years writing.
So, who did what in the writing?
We both did everything. I tended to do more of the interviewing. Susan tended to do more of the writing. Her style of writing at Time Magazine was better suited to a book like this than the more uh, loose New York Times newspaper writing that I was used to. But we both wrote, you know, many things in the book. We at the end, we passed it back and forth, and we had an understanding that we would, allow each other not to be abused certain number of peremptory challenges to language that we didn't like. And she tended not to like some of my favorite things that I'd written, and vice versa.
Well, it's a meld. I think it's a privilege to work with your spouse and survive, but also I think it makes it richer.
Well, it was hard sledding at times. I won't lie to you. And I think that people who set out to write a book with their spouse are asking for it's going to be tough,
Well, I
tough on the
walked
marriage.
away from the good half of the book, different sections I read, was there was a commitment, you talked about it, to get along, right? Somewhat
Yeah.
hierarchical to later generations. And I wonder how much that just reflects the culture, the American culture, that over the years it did change and about who respected whose opinion.
Well, I think that the one of the lucky things about the Ox and Sulzberger family is that they are more or less on the same page politically. That's not true of all families, and that was not true, for instance, of the family that owned the Los Angeles Times. The guy who ran it was a liberal, and his uncles and aunts and cousins, many of them, were very conservative. So that made things tougher. At the New York Times, I would say all of them, not without exception, but I would be willing to bet that there were not a lot of Trump votes amongst them.
That makes it somewhat easier. And I didn't realize you told one story about the White House and anyone came in and they it was just pointed out by you and Susan or that the times persist. The times will and has continued over a great expanse of time where the people who hold
I
the
didn't,
highest
I,
positions in the
I didn't.
land are there for a short period.
The thing about this family that made it worse 7 years of our professional lives was that we thought they were the most powerful family in American history because of exactly what you said. Their power was not temporary. Their power was through their ownership and control and actually having a member of the family running the New York Times, which was the most powerful voice journalistically in America and probably the world. And they uh, they had that no matter who the president was. Even now with Donald Trump not allowing the New York Times into the White House, which I don't know whether that's still in effect or not, but they're still a powerful voice. And it's like we likened it to being a family cabinet post because no matter who the president was, the New York Times was going to be at the table when policy was decided.
Until I read the book, I hadn't been thinking along that line that journalism or the names in journalism persist. It's like a secret monarchy, and the politicians recognize it, right, and are dutiful to it, and need to be perhaps. Um, so are you happy? I don't want to say with current events, but the way TikTok and other forms of media are communicating opinions and so-called truth?
Well, I'm a little perplexed about all the furor about TikTok. I mean, I do look at TikTok from time to time, and when I see TikTok, I see mostly, you know, kittens and puppies and little snippets of video that are innocuous. I don't see. I mean, you see some people who are, making polemical speeches, but they're not purporting to be journalists. They're just basically saying what they think is going on and what their opinion is. So I don't. I'm not worried about TikTok. I think much more, dangerous are things like, Fox News because they purport to tell the truth. TikTok is, it's videos of people saying what they think and their kids.
Well, what I was thinking of is Khomeini and Iran. The Shah was ruling Iran, and then he was in Paris, the Khomeini, and he sent back tape recordings for people to listen to, and that swelled into a movement that removed the Shah. And I've just been thinking of anything of the current way we communicate on the internet would do the same.
Well, I mean, I think that people are certainly now have a very easy opportunity to communicate digitally. And the moment that really changed the world in terms of the digital communications age was not the invention of the internet, but the invention of the World Wide Web, which allows now you to make a program like this and push a button and send it all over the world for nothing.
Citizen journalism, uh, which I find endlessly interesting because finally people have a chance to say something. They had letters to the editor and still do, but this can have followings, whatever this is. And I like to hear what people have to say. What do you do to get the daily news?
I read the New York Times every morning.
That's all?
No, but that's what I start with. I also
And
read the New
then
York Post, Washington Post, and various and sundry other things. But what I try to do is to be broad in my reading, and I am part of an organization that publishes something called Global Post.
would you care to share the names of what you read?
Well, I read the Atlantic. I read the New York Review of Books. I read books as well as things like that. I don't watch. I don't watch the news much on television anymore because I got so disgusted with the coverage of politics during the last campaign that I just basically gave it off because I think that what we have going now is an effort by the president and all of his minions to destroy traditional journalism to the extent they can. I mean, he's now calling for the elimination of MSNBC. I mean, what president would do that? Not one that I would respect. And I'm not trying to be coy about my political beliefs. I think that he is a dangerous man, and I hope that he will not succeed.
I'm glad you read the New York Times. At the risk of asking too personal a question, if you were there, how would you do it differently?
I would have more opportunities for people to send effectively letters to the editor, op ed columns, and things. I think it enriches the New York Times to have different voices with different perspectives. And I'm all for that. I really believe that is something. When Adolph Fox bought the New York Times, he didn't even want to have an editorial page. He was very much averse to any kind of controversy. And when he was against voting for women, but he published so many letters to the editor and columns by pro-suffrage people that when it passed, they sent him a letter of thanks for the coverage on the op-ed pages of the New York Times, which they believe had helped them so much. And I believe that's exactly what he would want. And I like that idea.
Right. So thank you kindly for appearing. I just want to say a few words. This is a principled man based on his views. He holds fast to his heart about truth, factual based reporting. Um, Perhaps less emphasized today, but maybe coming back a little ways, I hope. So, in your own life, truth is a good barometer of checking your what's true, what's an opinion. So stick to that. And I can see how much the New York Times, in his book, he talks about it's the family is the Times, but I can see anybody like him who worked there had the same thing. They blend, they meld with the New York Times as an institution of worthiness. So thank you for tuning in. Please remember to do something kind for someone you know and someone you don't know, and and do it every day going forward, because it will help you and it will help others who might be struggling with one thing or another. And remember, keep yourself informed, look for truth, and question, always question what's missing in an article or a report, just to broaden your own idea. What I do is I read both sides. And then I say, if we do this, how's it going to play out in 30, 40 years? But that just, I like to think ahead, and it's hard to do because not everybody can predict well. Thank you.
To contact Junia, send her an email at juniadonsthespark@gmail.com. For more information, program schedules, and news about future guests, go to www.juniadonthespark.com. Thank you for joining us. See you next time on Junia Doan's The Spark.
Local productions seen on Delta College Public Media are made possible with support from viewers like you. Thank you.